Chapter 6. Looking back, the next 5 minutes were the last straightforward ones of the whole job. The last time when I still thought it was going to be a run-of-the-mill, albeit rather intrepid, find this man and rescue him kind of a job. I know I still haven't explained what it is that I do exactly, but the problem is, I can't really. Not the important stuff. Most of the time, it's just a sort of fixer-finder deal with a small problem kind of job. There are a lot of people who do that sort of thing. Sometimes, as you may have gathered, I'm prepared to go a little bit further and take a steal, cover-up, kill someone kind of job. There's quite a few people who handle those too. But sometimes it's something else again, something nobody else can do, and that is what I'm finding hard to explain to you. It's to do with me, and someone who died a while back, but mainly to do with me. Still, my point is, nothing much happened in the next 5 minutes. I stepped silently into the room and saw that Auckland was sleeping in the bed. My run of dismally good luck was continuing. There was nobody else in the room, not a single guard of any shape or description. A small suitcase lay on the floor in front of the wardrobe, which interested me. Presumably, it and its contents had been provided by Auckland's captors, whoever they were. They were going to some lengths to keep him happy. The suite, if you're interested, was roomy and looked comfortable, and though some of the upholstery was in questionable taste, I'd say it represented reasonable value for money. Once I'd established that there was no one who was going to leap out at me and spoil my composure, I locked the suite door and put the latch down. I unwound a length of the micro cable I had with me and tied it around one leg of the bed and put the dispenser on the windowsill, ready for later. Then I pulled up a chair next to the bed and I lit a cigarette. I've done this sort of thing before, you see, and I can tell you that there are very, very few ways of waking somebody up quietly. If you poke them, they make a noise. If you do that nonsense about whispering in their ear while clamping your hand over their mouth, it scares the living shit out of them when they wake up, not surprisingly, and some of them make a hell of a racket thrashing about. One guy I tried waking that way made so much noise I had to knock him unconscious, and then wait 2.5 hours for him to come to. When he did, he made even more noise. In the end, I had to knock him out again and carry him away, which was not ideal. The best way I've found, and there's no patent on this, so feel absolutely free to use it, is to sit by the bed and smoke. There's a little bit of the brain that stays awake when you're asleep, keeping half an eye open, making sure that everything's ticking over nicely and that your feet aren't on fire or anything. After you've been sitting a while, a few smoke molecules drift down into the guy's lungs, and the brain doesn't notice for a while, but suddenly it thinks, "Now hang on, I'm asleep, I'm not smoking. Bloody hell, I'm not even a smoker. Something's going on." There's nothing to panic about yet, so it just prods the rest of the brain gently awake, giving it the option to react if it sees the need. The person very quietly and comfortably drifts to about 50% awakeness, drowsily checks out the situation, and then goes back to sleep if there's nothing wrong. But if there's a strange man dressed entirely in black holding a gun sitting smoking by the bed, however, they wake up very quickly and absolutely silently. Believe me, it works every time. While I waited, I thought. I hadn't really had the time in the last couple of days to apply myself to most of the points on my internal memo. I mean, sure, I'd bought batteries for the grav bender, useless bastard of a thing that it is, but I hadn't sat down and worked out what it was that the centre alone could supply that would move a gang to the lengths that this one had gone to. I had to hand it to them, actually. Not only had they snatched Auckland and spirited themselves in here, but now they were here, they were playing it pretty cool. Despite the fact that I was now sitting by the bed where my quarry was, I was no closer to understanding what exactly was going on. If I could get us both out and back to the centre in one piece, it didn't really matter, of course, but, I like to know these things. After a minute or two, Auckland began to stir in his sleep. I put my thoughts on hold and waited for him to drift awake, slipping the gun beneath my jacket so that he didn't have too much to deal with at once. And then I realised that he wasn't waking at all, but dreaming, so I leant forward to watch his face. Beneath the lids, his eyes were rapidly moving back and forth, and his body began to stir more frequently, his head slowly moving back and forward. Suddenly, he gasped in his sleep and whipped his head over to one side, face frowning. Then he quite clearly flinched, an arm groping up from under the covers to cover his face. When it fell away again, his eyes were screwed tightly shut and his face was rigid with fear. As I watched him, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, and my chest cooled as if ice water was dripping slowly through my lungs. I know about nightmares, you see. And by that, I don't just mean that I have them myself, I mean I know about them. I watched the twitching of his eyeballs and the muscles in his face, and I could almost read what was happening to him. I knew that he was not having an ordinary bad dream, and that's the point this whole thing changed, although I didn't really realise it then. A moment later, his eyes flew open and saw me. I smiled reassuringly, waited for him to get to 100% awake, and then spoke quietly. "It's all right. I'm one of the good guys, I guess." Auckland blinked and raised himself awkwardly up onto his elbows. "What are you doing here?" he mumbled, rubbing an eye. "I've come to take you home," I said quietly. "Come on, time to get up." He didn't have a chance to react to that before the next two things happened. The first was that a thin bar of light shone under the door, meaning that the light in the corridor had been turned on. Oh, bollocks, I thought. Here comes grief installment number 1. One of the gang has come to check on Auckland at exactly the wrong time. It was the first bad coincidence so far, and I knew it was well overdue, but what a time for it to happen, eh? "Come on," I hissed at Auckland. "Dress very, very quickly." I slipped off the chair and stepped lightly over to the door, gun ready. Then, the second thing happened. I heard a murmur of voices coming up the stairs. There was something a little odd about them, but I couldn't tell what until I heard the hacking cough that immediately followed. "Who's coming?" Auckland whispered, doing a fine unintentional slapstick routine as he tried blearily to climb into his trousers. His hair was sticking up at a variety of bizarre angles, and his face cried out for his glasses. "The police," I said. They might be run-of-the-mill cops, and they sure as hell weren't feeling at peak fitness, to judge from the sniffles and sneezes that were becoming increasingly audible as they made their way down the corridor. But they weren't stupid. Perhaps they'd even checked the railway area first, as I had, and then made their way to play. The gang had almost certainly registered in their own names, just as Auckland had, so no one suspected them of anything, and a lie is always more difficult to carry off than the truth. The police would have access to a list of every stableant. All they had to do was patch the guest list through and wait for a discrepancy. They'd found that the guest called Auckland was an outsider and thought they'd found me. And of course, they had. The lucky bastards. I pressed my ear close to the door, urging Auckland to get a move on. He had his glasses on by now, and was looking marginally more together, though still moving with maddening slowness. As soon as the gang heard the police were here, all hell was going to break loose. "Honey and lemon," I heard a voice say huskily. "Honey and lemon." "Yeah," his colleague replied wistfully, and then broke into a prolonged fit of coughing. "You all right?" sniffed the other one when the fit had subsided to wheezing. "Oh, that was the worst yet, I think." "Yeah, tell you what though, first thing I'm going to do is breathe germs all over the bastard." "I'm ready." This was from Auckland, who was standing by the bed, looking forlorn and lost. I felt for him. All he wanted to do was to be beetling around the centre, pushing back the frontiers of activity, and here he was instead, in somebody else's neighbourhood, caught between his kidnappers, the police, and someone he'd never even met before. "Okay," I said, and shepherded him towards the window. I picked up the microcable dispenser and dropped it out of the window, and then took out my pads. "Give me your hands." Auckland held them up like a befuddled child, and I rolled my foot pads onto his hands. "Now, what you're going to do," I said rapidly, "is slide down that cable. Don't say you can't do it because we haven't got the time to discuss it. Believe me, you're going to do it. The cable will hold your weight. You could carry a piano down if you wanted. The pads will stop it burning your hands, okay?" I didn't give him time to respond, but urged him up onto the sill. He sat with his legs out of the window, peering dubiously down towards the ground. "Oh dear," he said, and took his glasses off. I put the cable in his hands. "Hold tight," I told him, "and then bend your knees when you hit the ground." And then I pushed him. His quiet yelp was lost outside the window. As I climbed onto the sill, there was a knock at the door. I quickly rolled my own pads onto my hands. "Hello?" said one of the cops, and then sneezed violently. "Mr. Auckland, we'd like a word with you." "Yeah," said the other, "but we're going to cough at you first." I heard a soft thud outside, and clinging onto the sill with one hand, I reached out for the cable and pulled it in. The length snapped back, bringing the dispenser with it. I slipped it into my pocket before reaching out and slapping one of my hands to the wall outside. Then I swung my body out, supporting myself for one extremely tiring moment with one hand, and swung the window shut behind me. Quickly, which is the only way to do it, I handed myself down the wall of the hotel, checking for obstacles with my feet. And in about 20 seconds I was standing in the alley beside Auckland. As I ripped the pads off our hands, I heard a faint crash and saw the light of room 301 go on. With luck, the lack of our evident escape route would confuse them. We had a few moments to get the hell out. I grabbed Auckland by the arm and directed him down the side of the hotel, steering him through the undergrowth from behind. He tripped once and almost fell, but he apologized, which was cool of him. I once carried a woman 8 miles through swamp and she complained the whole way. When we got to the front, I slipped in front of him and I darted glances up and down the street. There was no one there. Life is like a video game, and when you get to a new screen, the thing to do is move as quickly as possible before the situation gets any worse. So, with Auckland trotting gamely behind me, I ran across the road, casting a glance back at the hotel. The police were evidently still trying to get their minds around an empty room that was locked from the inside, and with heads full of catarrh, that could take minutes. Lights were beginning to appear in some of the other windows, but for the time being, things were going well. With the police bumping around, the gang members would have to sit tight. What had looked like grief originally had turned out to be a stroke of luck. I vaulted over the railing and dropped onto the pathway that led down to the beach, and Auckland clambered after me. Sticking close to the wall, we descended until there was sand beneath our feet, and then I stared wildly round the beach, wondering what the hell we were going to do next. That's what I mean about A to Z plans, you see. I had no idea that things were going to turn out like this, so there was no way I could have planned things out. You just have to cope with what's happening and deal with the next bit when it comes. The next bit was now here. The obvious impulse was to hide, and that was neither a terrible idea nor impossible. Any of the beach houses would have made an adequate bolt hole, but though hiding is always appealing, it's not very forward-thinking. You notice that in films, when people get away from the bogeyman, for some reason they always go and hide somewhere that they can't get out of. The very top of the house or in the basement. It feels great for about 5 minutes, and then you realize you've trapped yourself more effectively than anyone else ever could have done. Also, Right now was the farthest we were going to get ahead of the people after us, and the thing to do was capitalise on that, not waste it by staying put. As Auckland stood patiently beside me, I put the beach houses out of my mind and thought laterally. What else was there around? Sand? That didn't sound promising. A couple of medium-sized barrels. Looked like they used to hold barbecue fluid or something. Not helpful. A large body of water. Motioning to Auckland to follow me, I ran in a crouch up to the water. It was flowing fairly swiftly. "Can you swim?" I asked him. No," he said. "Great." So much for that idea. I looked back at the hotel. Quite a lot of lights were on now, and there was evident activity in the hallway. It looked like it was only hotel staff. My mind threw up a quick, barely relevant thought to file away for worrying about later. Once they talked to the staff, the police were going to realise that Auckland, although an outsider, was unlikely to be the guy who'd vaulted over their desk that morning. The authorities might let a couple of cops trace a single intruder, but once they realised there were two inside at once, matters would take a much more serious turn. I looked back at the water, thinking furiously. "Being very, very careful to be as invisible as possible," I whispered. "Go and look in those huts. Look for a dinghy, anything." Auckland padded obediently over to them and disappeared inside the first one. I ran to the next row and went through them. There were tables, chairs, books, bits and pieces, but nothing even vaguely resembling a dinghy. I walked back out to the shoreline, feeling our advantage, such as it was, slipping away. Then, thank Christ, my mind went ping! I ran back up the beach to the slipway and grabbed 2 of the barrels. They weren't perfect, but they still had their caps, and they were going to have to do. Back at the shore, Auckland hadn't found anything else either, so I told him to go and grab 2 more cans. I returned to the nearest hut, and inside was a large wooden table, so I manoeuvred it out of the doorway and carried it down to the shore. Taking the insecto-sucks out of my pocket, I set them for suck both sides and slapped them at equal intervals on the tabletop. Then I positioned the 4 cans, one on top of each of the pads, and pushed down hard. Flipping the table over, I indicated to Auckland to grab the other end, and we carried it down to the waterline. I checked that the caps of the barrels were screwed tight, and then pushed the contraption out into the water. It floated. "Super," I said. "You're intending, I take it," muttered Auckland with a worried frown, "that we sit on that, are you?" "That's sort of what I had in mind, yeah." Won't it sink?" "That question," I chirped encouragingly, steering him into the water, "will be answered in the very near future." When the water was up to Auckland's waist, I held the raft steady, and he clambered onto it. The end dipped, but the tabletop remained several inches above the water. I pushed the raft out further towards the centre of the river until the water was up to my chest. Then, bracing my arms on the other end, I heaved my body up, slipped my legs up and threw them onto the underside of the table. "Did you used to be a gymnast?" Auckland asked, peering at me through his glasses. "No, musician," I said, flapping my hands in the water to send the boat out further still. "You should try carrying amplifiers around." When we were safely clear of the banks, I steered the raft around until it was heading straight down the river. By now the current had got hold of us, and we were already about 50 yards downstream of the Powers. The hotel was a blaze of light, and 1 or 2 people were standing outside on the street. I rather thought, given that the time was now nearly midnight, that tonight's events might push even Gerald the Talking Duck off page 4. Instructing Auckland to keep an eye on our direction and to flap his hands in the water if corrections were needed, I got the map of stable and my lighter out. After a quick glance around, I quickly snapped it alight and looked at the map. Apart from a detour about a mile downstream, the river ran through undeveloped areas of Stable, which was very encouraging. What it did when we hit the neighbourhood wall was anyone's guess, but for the time being we had an ideal mode of transport. I put the map away and tried to think about the next bit, but it wouldn't come. The choice was between jumping ship a mile further on and then melting into the town, or sticking to the river and dealing with the problem when we couldn't go any further. My brain clearly felt it had done its bit for the time being, and I didn't push it. The raft was holding up well. The pads work on molecular attraction rather than actual suction, so the water had no effect on them. And with the table legs to lean back on, it was actually surprisingly comfortable, if not cosy. I settled for sitting back and admiring the view. Auckland was silent and seemed to be doing the same thing. I was a bit tense when buildings first began to rise on either side of us, but the town was so clearly asleep that I soon relaxed again. There's something very strange about being on the water at night, especially inland. You see the back of things from an odd angle, with just a few lights here and there, glowing orange in the darkness, and you feel as if you're slipping unseen like a visiting ghost through an alien town. When the buildings began to shade away again as the river headed back out into the country, I turned and looked at Auckland, who was gazing peaceably down at the water. I lit up a cigarette, cupping the glowing end in my palm to avoid showing a light, and he looked up. "That's bad for you, you know." Strangely enough, I did. All non-smokers seem to live in the belief that smokers have wandered naively through life, bereft of the knowledge that their habit is extremely bad for them. "I'll tell them it's bad for them," they seem to think, "and they'll immediately throw all their cigarettes away." Normally, it irritates me, but I was tired, and he didn't mean any harm by it. He was an actioneer, after all. "Yeah, I know," I replied soothingly. He smiled and looked around at the raft, nodding approvingly. "Very professional. Not bad at all in the time provided. Do you do this sort of thing often?" Not this exactly, but this kind of thing." "Huh. What do you do exactly?" "Don't you start," I said, and then I realized he wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. "Yeah, I sort things out. Sometimes that means finding things, or people." "Ah, and now you've found me." "Yep." "Was it hard?" Not really, no, which worries me slightly." "Why?" "Well, nothing's ever easy. It'll catch up with me sooner or later." He smiled, and seemed to know what I meant. "For example," I said, addressing a question which was going to have to be dealt with sooner rather than later, "what kind of gang are we dealing with here?" He looked at me for a moment. "Gang?" "Yeah, you know, the people who brought you here. What do they want? How many of them are there? Where are they from? What are their names?" "There is no gang," he frowned. "I came here by myself." In the distance there was the faint hum and chirrup of insects, and the sound of trees rustling in the wind. The river gurgled a low babble around us, and the end of my cigarette crackled very faintly, its glow cupped in my hand. "Oh, right," I said. Remember back when I wrote my internal memo? I said there was one more thing I thought of, and that I'd only mention it if it was relevant? Well, it turns out it was relevant. The thought was this. For a gang to organise getting into the centre, finding and snatching Auckland, pulling him out of the neighbourhood, and all of this without being detected or anyone knowing who they were, was a very complex undertaking. What was the simplest alternative? Auckland left under his own steam. Which was all very well as a concept, but I had no evidence and no reason to suppose that he would have done that, and it would have made no difference what I did anyway. I still had to find out where he was and get to him. I don't just put off thinking about things because I'm lazy. There's a time and a place for the truth. I'm not as stupid as I look, and I'm not necessarily going to tell you everything, so watch out. But I must admit I was surprised. I say surprised. I almost fell off the raft. "Oh," I said again. Auckland watched me, eyebrows raised, and I thought for a moment. "You can explain that to me at some stage if you like," I said. "In fact, you're probably going to have to. There's a lot of high-powered can-do people out there looking for you, and I'm supposed to be taking you back to them." Auckland made as if to speak, but I held up my hand. "For the time being, it will only confuse matters, and I've got enough to worry about already. The police back there were looking for me, not you, and by now they'll know that there's 2 intruders in the neighbourhood, and they've got your name. Nothing you can tell me is going to change the issue. If we don't get out of stable as soon as possible, we're going to become dead people." I'd talked to Sned, you see, and I'd found out a bit more about his DNA exploration workaround. It involved the drug called Strim. Way back, Strim was sort of like Dopaz in some areas, the popular heavy drug. Its effects are far wilder than Dopaz's though, and not everyone's idea of fun. It fucks around with genetic material, temporarily changing the brain's neural organization. Perception is not just warped or distorted, it becomes completely alien, transporting the user into an utterly different universe, one that is, by all accounts, a nightmare. Over the years, people in Turn neighbourhood, fun-loving lunatics that they are, used the drug so often and in such increasing quantities that natural selection weeded out those who couldn't take it, and in time, strands of the population became immune to its effects. Sned's workaround involved regular use of Strim in such quantities that would kill 100 normal people stone dead instantly. Having to spend the rest of your life with a digital clock on your forehead, branded as a criminal, would have been a far from ideal life, but it would have been a life. For Auckland and I, there was no let-out clause. If we were caught, we would either die instantly or in 1 year's time. Neither option appealed. Auckland nodded, which, again, put him well above the ranks of my normal rescuees. He saw the position. "I'm sorry I screwed up the situation back there for you," I said. "But they would have cracked on sooner or later." "I know," he nodded. "I wasn't thinking very clearly when I came. At all, in fact." "How the hell did you get in?" I asked, broaching what was to me a bit of a burning issue. You saw the grief that I had, and I'm built for this kind of thing. "I had myself delivered," he replied. "A friend of mine left the centre many years ago and transferred to Natsai neighbourhood. Computers were his thing, you see. He's quite high up now. Stable bought their important computer from Natsai, the one that they used to run the big vidi screens in the atmosphere controls. That was a long, long time ago, and it was just about their only import. No one knows about it apart from the authorities, of course. Well, a few days ago, they had a new one delivered, and I'm sure they'll be so pleased with it that they won't notice it isn't quite as powerful as promised." "And why isn't it?" Because where the tertiary RAM units are supposed to be, there's just a space. It's not very large, but it was big enough." "Nice," I said. "A diplomatic pouch." He laughed. "Yeah, in effect. One with a service panel in the back, which unusually opens from the inside too. I was prepared to sit inside for a few days, waiting for just the right time. As it happened, it was left in the street for 10 minutes. I just popped out and walked away. No one gave me a second glance. I shook my head. Contacts of that sort I would give someone else's right arm for. Even Zenda can't pull strings like that. The thought of her held me for a moment, and I wondered how things were going back in Can-Do City. If Royne had passed on my message, and she was pretty good like that, then Zenda would know that both I was unstable and that I'd been in serious shit when I sent it. I wondered if she was worried about me. Sort of hoped she was. Not to a degree that would in any way inconvenience her or distract her from being the hyper-powered dynamo that she was, but just a little bit would be nice. "That," I said, "is very reasonably flash. You get high marks for that." "Thank you," he said proudly. "I've never done anything like it before. The idea just popped into my head." The downside being, sadly, that it's no use to us now. I arrived tourist class, leaping large distances, running like hell, and almost being killed, and that's no use either. They'll have police wedged down that pipe that I came in like sardines. There's no other way that you know of? Nope, I said cheerily. From now on, we're into creative and original thought. Chapter 7. A large police manhunt is underway today following an incident in play area last night. 6 policemen, 3 small children, and a bunny rabbit were killed when Fell Auckland, a fugitive from justice, escaped the Powers Hotel. Police have yet to release a picture of this lonesome thief, child molester, animal hurter and defiler of graves, but he is described as being in his 60s and of medium build, with thinning grey hair and a nasty nose. A younger accomplice, whom the police describe simply as agile, is also being sought. If you see anyone who meets either of these descriptions, you should report them to the police immediately. Following a heart attack brought on by overwork, Gerald the talking duck is in hospital, where his condition is described as good. Does he think his doctors are all quacks? We'll have that story after the break. 4 o'clock in the morning, that deep, dead hour, found us still floating along on the crest of a table. Auckland dozed off after a while, propped up against one of the legs. He twitched occasionally, but for the most part his sleep seemed untroubled. I stayed awake, trying to think of a way out. The problem was that I simply didn't know enough about stable. Nobody did. From what Auckland had told me about his intrusion route, there must be a way in somewhere, but it was a dead cert that it would be guarded to the gills, even if we could find out where it was. It was also a cert that, come sunrise, every stableant with an ounce of public feeling in their hearts, which meant all of them, would have been convinced that we had to be caught at all costs. They wouldn't have photos, but the art student could have given them quite a thorough description of Auckland, and sooner or later we'd give ourselves away in public. We had to stay away from public areas. The river and the strip of countryside on either side was our only hope. But I was tired and nothing much came to me. You have to remember that since I'd last slept, I'd travelled to Royale, got across it, undergone my rather trying intrusion experience, hacked around the derelict area, climbed up and down walls, fashioned makeshift rafts, and so on and so forth. "Enough already," my brain was saying. "Time out." Well, it couldn't have one, as I had to keep watch and make sure that we didn't veer towards the bank. So it huffily withdrew all thinking services and left me with 2 blankly staring eyes. I looked up from lighting another cigarette to see that Auckland had woken and was looking blearily at me. "Ah," he said. "It wasn't a dream, then? How disappointing." He tried to stretch his legs, discovered that it couldn't really be done without kicking me in the face, and gave up. Shivering, he wrapped his jacket tighter around him against the cold and peered out across the water. "So," he said, "is it any less likely we're going to be dead by the end of the day yet?" Not significantly, no. Ultimately, we're going to run out of river. We could head for the bank and camp out in those trees, but I wouldn't advise it. There's nowhere to go, and they'll search them sooner or later. I think our best bet is staying put until we get to the wall and then see what happens. I didn't add that what happened might well involve bullets. He was a smart guy, and I'm sure he figured that out for himself. Something had to happen to the river when it got to the wall. I had no idea what, but I just had to hope that it was something helpful. It was our only chance. "Do you think they'll know we're on the river?" "Nah. Think about it. What they found was a locked and empty room. The bed looked slept in, and that's all they know. You could have jumped ship hours before they got there. They don't know that there was any urgency on our part, and without that they won't think of the river. Why screw about with water when you could just walk? They'll probably assume we're in stables somewhere hiding out, and they won't know for sure we're together. The descriptions they get of you won't make them leap to the conclusion that you're an old hand at commando tactics, like fashioning rafts out of tables. For the time being, I think we're moderately safe where we are." Auckland nodded, seeming a little comforted. I was glad one of us was. Things at the wall went badly at first. It sort of crept up on us, and by the time I realised what was happening, it was too late. I'd kind of assumed that we'd be able to jump ship before we got there, but sadly not. By 5, dawn was doing its thing, and a final bend in the river led us into a straight run to the neighbourhood wall. The banks had widened over the last hour, and getting to them would have been no mean feat against the strengthening current. Then, about half a mile out, the gradually tapering banks were replaced by brick walls. For a while they were only 6 feet or so high, which I guess we could have handled, but by the time we were getting really close they had risen to 20 feet. Worse still, they were no longer sheer, but bent back over the water. Getting the raft to them wouldn't have been easy. Deconstructing the raft while standing on it to get the pads would have poked its head into very difficult status. We would only have 2 pads each, and Auckland handling himself up one of those increasingly curved walls was firmly labelled impossible, and cross-referenced to the forget it and I think not categories as well. Ahead of us, the river narrowed abruptly, feeding into a hole in the wall which was about 10 feet wide and 4 high. "We're going into that hole, aren't we?" Auckland asked sadly. "Yep." "Any idea what's on the other side?" "Nope." "Righto," he sighed. About 100 yards away from the wall, my brain, sensing that I was imperiling its safety yet again, called a temporary truce. "I'll deal with you later," it muttered, glaring at me. "What the hell are we going to do now, then?" I think it was secretly glad to be back on the team, though, because after a moment I came up with the first bit. "Come and sit next to me at the back," I said to Auckland, and he complied resignedly. "Listen. When we get to the wall, we're going to stick both of our hands up and we're going to grab it. The current's pretty fast, so it's going to be hard, but what we have to try and do is hold on for long enough so that I can look and see what happens inside, okay?" Auckland nodded, putting his glasses neatly into his pocket. I zipped up the inside pocket of my jacket, which has a waterproof lining. I come prepared. In the last 30 yards, the current increased dramatically. 10 yards away, we stuck up our hands and sat for a few moments, probably looking like a very dour pair of accountants, dourly getting into the spirit of a water ride in a theme park. The hole was taller than it looked, and at the last minute we had to hoik ourselves onto our knees to reach the wall. My hands smacked into the slightly slippery stone, and for a moment I was sure they weren't going to hold. The current dragged us past for a second, giving me a glance of an interior that was very noisy and strangely light, and then by straining arm muscles we managed to hold the raft steady. It was clear we couldn't hold on for long, however, so I slipped my head in and checked it out. What I saw was so monumentally surprising that it took me a while to work out what it was, and then even longer to work out what it meant. The narrow river of water continued in a concrete conduit for about 5 yards past the wall, and then broadened into a pool about 10 yards across, the water whirling choppily around in a dishearteningly dangerous way. At the centre of the pool there was something very strange. A channel of water about 6 feet across shot straight up as far as the eye could see. 4 spotlights were trained on the spout, which seemed to be contained within a tube of thick glass. "What can you see?" gasped Auckland, clinging onto the lip of the hole with all his might, bless him. I don't know, but it's very nicely lit." It clicked soon enough, of course. You probably think you were there before me, but of course you're not hanging onto a wall while crouched on a raft. Or, if you are, you're doing it of your own free will, and I bet the water isn't flowing as quickly. The river didn't flow out of the neighbourhood and into the toilet outside. Water of that quantity would have been hard to come by, and constantly refining turd soup from Royale would have been a real pain for the authorities. So instead they'd set this up. The river was zapped up to some pipe in the roof, sent over to the other side, and dropped back down to join the start of the river. That was impressive engineering by anyone's standards. They had to have some help from somewhere. Anti-gravity frolics of that kind are pretty state-of-the-art stuff, and that sort of technology is bloody expensive and held very close by the people developing it. The stable authorities had to have some pretty stunning contacts themselves. I filed away the question of what exactly it was they had to offer in exchange for later consideration. For immediate consideration was what this offered us. My arms were getting very tired, and Auckland's contribution had waned to negligible. There was very little choice. We couldn't go back, and once we were inside, there was nowhere to go except into the pool. The current in there was fierce. There was a very strong pull from the glass tube sucking the water up into the field. "Auckland!" I shouted, and he wearily ducked his head under the wall. I let him take a second to take everything in, and then I shouted, "We're going up that tube!" The prospect clearly alarmed him a great deal, but there was nothing I could do about that. I wasn't regarding the experience in a wholly positive light myself, but we weren't in a choice situation, and he realised that. "Oh dear, oh dear." "Yeah, I know what you mean. Look, we're going to have to go down on the table. We don't want it to get in there first, or it might block the tube, and with that sort of suction, we'll never get it off. So we let go, ride the rapids. You ready?" "Oh dear." I took that as a yes and let go. The raft immediately cannoned down the channel towards the pool, and in about 2 seconds we were bouncing around a jacuzzi from hell. Almost immediately, 2 of the barrels sprang off the bottom of the table. The pads were unable to cope with the power of the current. The raft tipped and turned us over, dumping us into the churning water. I grabbed Auckland's coat and pulled him towards me the best that I could. We were set on course now, spinning around the pool increasingly quickly, with the table and 2 barrels in close pursuit. Auckland looked deeply unhappy about the whole experience, and I grinned maniacally at him to try and cheer him up. I look after my clients. "At the last possible moment," I screamed, trying to communicate above the din, "take the deepest breath you can. Breathe till you're full, and then take another breath. It's gonna have to last you a while." I didn't add that it might be the last one he took. In another couple of seconds we were whipped under the bottom end of the tube, hauled into the column of water, and dropped towards the sky. Immense speed, a rushing sound, and a feeling of crushed and utter helplessness. For the first few moments that was all I knew. And then I noticed that I still had a handful of Auckland's jacket and tightened my grip. If by some chance I got out of this, I wanted him with me. The elevator ride lasted around 40 seconds, I suppose, but it seemed a hell of a lot longer than that. The last third seemed to expand, swelling until time almost stopped, with nothing but the sound of water and the glint of the glass tube reflecting light from the spots below. Although the impact had knocked a little out of me, I still had enough breath left for a while, but I had no idea how long there was still to go or what would happen next. If the chute reached roof level and then was diverted into a pipe to run across the other side, we were finished. There was no way I could hold my breath that long, and I'm youngish and pretty damn fit. I'd be holding on to a dead man's jacket before we got to a 10th of the way across stable. I tried, but in the circumstances, I couldn't quite get my head around the physics of the whole thing. To keep the river cycle going, I hazarded vaguely, similar quantities of water would have to cross the ground in one direction and the roof in the other. If the pipe was the same size as the river, the water speed would be the same, probably, but if it was thinner, it would have to be quicker, wouldn't it? And if so, how thin would it have to be quick enough? I didn't have a pen, a piece of paper, a calculator, and a pitcher of alcohol to hand, so I gave up trying to work it out. And almost immediately afterwards, the next thing happened. Suddenly, the glass tube came to an end, and the column of water spurted a few feet above it, and then broke up, falling around the sides. I heard Auckland gasp for breath as we fell back, and were bounced by the water charging up behind us. We slid painfully across a sort of conduit thing before landing in a pair of bruised heaps on the ground. With one mind, we flailed unseeingly to the side, and instinctively crawled out of the continual flow of water. Within 5 yards, we came to a ridge in the ground, and I heaved myself to my knees and turned around to sit on it. Auckland joined me a moment later, chest heaving, and we looked at each other wearily. The actioneer looked like an experiment in aquatic rat breeding, and I doubt I appeared exactly dapper. After a moment we both laughed, quietly at first, but then louder and louder, pointing at each other with weak arms. Each time we thought we were going to get it under control, one of us would break out again and the other would follow. It was kind of hysterical, I guess, but it was a good thing all the same. When we eventually got a grip, I unzipped my inside pocket and got out a cigarette. Auckland retrieved his glasses and put them on. Both thus armed with our aids to thought, we gazed slowly around the area we found ourselves in. We were in a low, dark room, the size of the whole of stable neighbourhood. The ceiling was about 10 feet high, and tiny bulbs set into the floor shed a little light at intervals, enough to give an impression of how the thing worked. In front of us and to the left was the end of the water column. Water pumped out of it at a constant rate, and after a moment one of the barrels, closely followed by the others, popped out like corks and fell with a drum roll to the floor. The table came up in pieces, which was good. It could have jammed around the bottom of the tube, which sooner or later would have alerted whoever maintained this setup. The water dropped into the wide conduit we'd scraped across. This conduit was in two parts. One led by our side and behind us, and the other went off into the distance. Both were slightly angled to keep the water moving. At intervals along the conduit's length were small let-off pipes, which released what was presumably a gauged amount of water onto the floor. The room, I saw, looking around, stretched as far as we could see to the front and to the right. It was divided into channels about 6 feet across by low ridges like the one we were perched on, and although it was too gentle to sense, I realized that the floor must slope very slightly from where we were to the other side of stable. In fact, it was the one permutation I hadn't tried to work out in the column of water. Instead of pumping the water back across in a narrow pipe or letting it flow at a river's width, they had the opposite arrangement. Water fell into the conduits and was dispersed across the width of the neighbourhood, falling into the channels. There, at a depth of no more than an inch, it flowed across to the other side, where presumably it was funneled into a chute that dropped it down at the source of the stable river. Peculiar, observed Auckland. It transpired that he'd gone through similar calculations in the tube, and zappy can-do overachiever that he was, had been able to work the thing out in his head. He'd probably known exactly how narrow the pipe was going to have to be for us to survive, realized how unlikely that was, and was pleasantly surprised to still be alive. I was too, I guess, and the mood, although subdued, was buoyant. Auckland shook his head briefly like a venerable old dog, spraying some of the water out of his hair and making him look like he'd just been electrocuted. While taking off his squelchy shoes, he turned and looked up at me. "So, what now, Mr. Stark?" "Just call me Stark," I said. I liked Auckland, I decided. From the purely business point of view, he was good to work with. He did what he was told, he didn't endlessly pipe up with unworkable suggestions and disturb my flow of thought, and he didn't complain much either. He was also pretty relaxed for someone of his age and background. I'm used to finding myself in strange places, and it's the story of my life. Most actioneers, with a few honourable exceptions, would have needed months of therapy after this sort of thing, and yet here he was, just patiently waiting for the next bit. Liking him was going to complicate the issue, if and when we ever got back home, of course, but that problem was some way back in the queue. "What happens now," I said, standing, "is that we walk." "Where?" Auckland frowned, peering eloquently out into the gloom. "Anywhere. There's no way out sitting here. Any move in any direction increases the probability of us finding a solution." He nodded approvingly. "You're not an actioneer, are you?" he asked. "No," I smiled. "Not my sort of thing." Pity." Shoes in hand, we walked along the ridge, which was just wide enough not to involve a major high-wire balancing act. It was still rather tiring, though, and after a while we climbed down and traipsed along the channel instead, feet slushing through the shallow water. I was still trying to decide whether it was better to head back for the side of the room or keep going for the centre, when Auckland pointed at the floor. "Look," he said. Bending down, I saw what he meant. A thin stream of tiny bubbles was rising from the floor. "Looks like they've got a leak." I wonder," I replied, and crawled a few feet up the channel, staring down into the water. Sure enough, I soon found another stream of bubbles, and within a minute I had established that the channel was full of them, at regular 1-yard intervals. I think they're having a little rain in stable this morning. Ah, how clever, said Auckland, getting it at once. I guess it was, really. It hadn't occurred to me at first, because most neighbourhoods with roofs put on them specifically do away with the weather. The last thing they'd be doing was developing complicated workarounds so they could have it back again. In stable, of course, things were different. They still wanted weather. It was just the outside world that they'd renounced. So instead of pumping water across in the quickest time possible, they'd killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Auckland walked over to the next channel and peered down into the water there. No bubbles in this one, he observed. That must be how they control it. For a sunny day, they set the outlets out there to just send water down channels without the holes. For a downpour, they just send it down the ones with holes. Today must be a light shower. No wonder they need such a flash computer, I said, shaking my head. I couldn't get my mind around so much pointless ingenuity. If they could just get a grip on the way the world was now and come to terms with things outside, they could all have normal rain without all this high-tech dicking around. It was all very clever, but kind of stupid too. Then a thought struck me. I have an idea, I said, and Auckland's face immediately brightened. It was touching, really, to see his developing faith. I like that in a client. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk in separate directions, looking up at the ceiling. Ah, I see, he said sagely. Why? No system is perfect, okay? There's no perpetual motion. With condensation and spillage and evaporation, tiny amounts of water must be lost out of the cycle. Either up here or down there. Over time, the whole thing would just run dry unless there's water coming in too. Either they purify water out of Royale, or they get it from somewhere else. I'm plumping for the latter because I can only see one input tube. Where do you think they get it from then? Same place as everyone else, I said, pointing up at the ceiling. Rain falls on that roof. Pure water falling from the sky. They'd be insane not to make use of it. Maybe there's a way of getting out the way that it gets in. So we split up and walked quickly, staring up at the ceiling, which was grey, featureless, and intermittently covered with algae. Auckland tripped once over a ridge and went splat down into the water, but I pretended that I hadn't noticed. I don't think you can find that sort of thing funny once you've realised how fragile most men's dignity is. Take mine, for instance. You can almost see through it. When Auckland shouted, we were so far apart that I couldn't even see him. The tiny bulbs attached to the ridges cast little pools of light across the water, but the glow didn't reach very far. He shouted again out of the gloom, and I headed towards the sound, hoping that the system up here ran itself and that there wasn't some engineer monitoring the whole thing. The actioneer was standing on a ridge when I found him, squinting upwards. I joined him and followed his gaze, and I saw light. I clapped Auckland so hard on the back that I had to grab him to prevent him from ending face up in the water again. When he recovered his balance, he grinned at me, and then we both stared upwards. Above us was a hole, about 3 feet square and covered with a grill. The mesh was too fine to show what lay beyond, but I could guess. The outside world. I hoisted Auckland onto my shoulders, and with some difficulty, he reached up to poke the grill. It didn't move immediately, and I had time to wish I'd found my furt before leaving the apartment 200 years ago. Then he shoved it harder, and one end moved. Another push sent it up like a little trapdoor, revealing what lay beyond. Life is seldom easy. Despite the evidence of the last couple of days, the gods of fate rarely go out of their way to help me, and they certainly hadn't here. The god in charge of giving Stark a break was tied up in meetings or taking a long weekend, probably. We were looking up into a square well that was at least 12 feet deep. I'd realised that the stable wall would be thick, but not that thick. The sides were absolutely featureless, with no handholds, elevator, or ladder to be seen. At the top was another grille. I let Alkland back down again and stood for a moment, head drooping. The pads were gone. Even if one of them had made it up here, it would take hours to find, and it was far more likely that they were stuck fast to something down below. For a moment, I felt very, very tired. "So," Alkland said cheerily, "who's going up first?" I looked up slowly and saw that he was joking. "You." I smiled, and he laughed, and that was enough. I got Alkland to stand with his feet a yard apart and angled slightly to make him as firm a base as possible. He cupped his hands, and I stepped into them, placed my left foot lightly on his shoulder, and checked my balance. Then I quickly pulled the right up, planted it on his other shoulder, and simultaneously straightened. So far, so good. I was standing with my torso up in the well. The next bit was going to be a bastard, and knowing that Alkland wouldn't be able to hold me up indefinitely, I got to it. "Hold my feet," I said, and felt his hands clamp around my ankles. I let myself sway back so that my shoulders were leaning against the wall, and then I very carefully raised my right foot, pulling my knee as far into my body as possible. Alkland stumbled slightly, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought I was going to drop down onto the ridge back first. But he regained his balance and altered his position so that he was now bracing me in the right direction, my left foot now pushing against the top of his chest. I reached down and took my right foot in my hand, and then very slowly pulled it up towards me. It was a struggle, but I managed to bring it into the well. Once it was past the lip, I planted it squarely onto the opposite wall and pushed hard. When I was as sure as I was going to be that I was adequately braced, I pulled my other foot up, carefully slipping that in and planting it next to the other one. I felt relatively secure for the first time. Slowly, arching my back, I wriggled my shoulders while pushing hard with my legs, trying to edge my back up the wall. From below, I heard the sound of faint giggling. "Shut the fuck up, will you?" I said, trying not to laugh. "This isn't as easy as it looks." The tide began to turn, and I could feel my shoulders slowly raising above the level of my feet. After a while, it became a little easier, and within a minute I was in a sort of sitting position, straight back against the wall and legs rigid in front of me. I negotiated myself around until my back was pressed into one of the corners, turning the well into a diamond, which would be easier to climb up. With one foot on each of the opposite walls, and getting what purchase I could with my hands, I began to ease my way up the well, 1 inch at a time. It took about half an hour. Twice I felt my back slipping and was sure I was going straight back down again, to land on top of Alkland's anxiously upturned face. By expanding my chest as far as possible, I was able to halt the slide and continue. But by the time I got to the top, my heart was beating at a dangerous rate and my legs were shaking violently, the muscles about ready to give up. Angling my back so as to jam myself as best as I could, I reached up and shoved the grill. It didn't give. Not even a little bit. "Bastard!" I wailed quietly. "How's it going?" Alkland called up. "Badly." Good, he said optimistically. That's been an encouraging sign so far. I realised there was something I could try, and reaching carefully into my pocket, I pulled out the gun. I set the energy output to maximum diffusion, covered my face and fired at the grill. There was a foot and a few droplets of molten metal sprinkled over me. Even before I opened my eyes, the increase in light told me it had worked. There was a hole in the grill about a foot in diameter, through which sunlight was streaming. A quiet whoop from below me told me that Auckland knew what had happened. A couple more quick foots from the gun expanded the hole, and I reached out and put one arm on the ceiling, scrabbling to get some purchase. My other arm went out the other way, and I manfully hauled my head out, followed by my shoulders. The rest was easy. I rolled to one side and then lay for a moment, panting. Around me, all I could see was white stone, and above me was the sky. The real sky. After a while, I levered myself to a sitting position and looked around, feeling slightly dizzy. I was sitting at the bottom of a large and shallow depression, obviously designed to funnel rainwater towards the grill. The stone stretched for acres in every direction but one. Behind me, it came to an abrupt halt about 200 yards away. Dragging myself wearily to the hole, I called down to Auckland. "Take your jacket off and wrap it around your hands." While he did so, I took the micro cable out and fed the end down to him. I wasn't terribly confident that this was going to work. The retractor in a micro cable dispenser is strong enough to handle small loads, but Auckland, although neither big nor fat, was a whole human being, and they were not designed with that kind of thing in mind. "This is going to be touch and go," I said, and Auckland nodded, as if he had expected no less. "As soon as you can, wedge yourself in." He grabbed the end of the cable and wrapped it several times around his heavily padded hands. I positioned myself over the hole, legs firmly planted on either side, and then flicked the retractor switch. For a moment, it worked smoothly, pulling Auckland swiftly up until his head and shoulders were in the well, and then the soft humming started to veer towards a buzzing, and the rate of climb decreased markedly. Slowly, Auckland spiralled higher, and I could see one hand groping up for the edge of the grill. As his fingers scrabbled against it, the retractor gave up the ghost with a vzzt, and I lunged down and grabbed the actioneer's hand, nearly joining him in a quick ride back down to the bottom. The jacket slipped, but I grabbed his wrist with my other hand and slowly hauled him up until his head and shoulders were through the hole. I helped him until he was out, and then we both fell back in separate directions. We lay on our backs for quite some time. It seemed to be the thing to do.